Hi, I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking with Patrick Fuchs, the Commissioner on the Surface Transportation Board, about supply chain and goods movement issues and the role of the STB. Commissioner, thanks so much. We're really excited to have you join us here at Supply Chain University.
Yeah, many thanks for having me, Jeff. I think Supply Chain University has yielded really insightful information and it's influenced my own thinking, so it's truly an honor to join you today.
Thanks, and it's doubly fun to have you here since we used to work together at OMB.
I was going to say exactly that makes it especially enjoyable. So it's great to see you.
Especially fun. So yeah, it's awesome. So maybe we can start just wondering, how you first got interested in supply chain issues and how you apply those experiences in your work at the STB.
Yeah, sure. I became interested in supply chain issues at university. Because the policy discussion was really centered on objective data and practical solutions. It's a field in which, as you say, you can apply economic tools to kind of make an observable and an immediate difference, improving people's lives. And so I find that very fulfilling and enriching. Received a graduate position at the University Transportation Center. From there, I spent some time at the GAO. But I was fortunate enough to be selected as a presidential management fellow at the Office of Management and Budget, where I spent the first several years of my career overseeing significant rules from the Department of Transportation and other entities at OIRA. And of course, OIRA had extraordinary associate administrators during my tenure. But as you know, just better than just about anybody, OIRA is really replete with really smart and rigorous analysts. And, my job there was to help agencies that oversee aspects of the supply chain make regulations and collections more net beneficial for society, more beneficial or less costly, and hopefully both. And so, after a few years at OIRA, the Senate changed and the body was faced with a number of kind of major transportation related priorities and imperatives. And so, I was lucky enough to be hired to handle rail and hazmat and other infrastructure and surface transportation issues under Chairman Thune. And it really was, just an incredible time to work under his leadership. Several major transportation bills were signed into law, including the $305 billion FAST Act and reauthorizations of the Surface Transportation Board and NTSB, FMC, and other agencies. So, following my time with the Senate, I joined the STB. I had the honor to be nominated and confirmed to my current position, and I'm about halfway through a 5-year term. So, my entire career has been spent on supply chain issues, both in the executive branch and the legislative branch, and I've seen it from executive agencies and independent agencies. So it's really been interesting to see it from different vantage points.
It really is a fantastic background for your current position. Can you talk a bit about the STB and how it works and its mission and authorities?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the STB is an independent agency, which I think, most viewers of the episode would know that, we don't serve at the pleasure of the president, and thus we have perhaps a bit more autonomy than a typical executive agency had. And the agency itself is charged with the economic regulations of various modes of surface transportation, particularly freight rail. But also aspects of motor carrier transportation, pipeline transportation, non-contiguous domestic water transportation, and others. Our general mission is to ensure a sound and competitive and efficient transportation network. We protect the smooth flow of interstate commerce. We have exclusive jurisdiction in our field of regulation, which basically means that we preempt other remedies that might be sought under state or federal law. So if I were to kind of summarize our authorities, I would say, first, we're a licensing authority, exit and entry licensing. So, think about construction, line sales, abandonments, discontinuances within the rail sphere. And you could imagine, Jeff, that, if licensing were to occur, for example, at the state level, you could see a patchwork of regulation that might challenge lines and operations that connect to the interstate network or, go across state lines, et cetera. What's interesting within our licensing authority is we also have merger review authority. Most industries are subject to merger review by the DOJ and the FTC. whereas within the rail sphere and other modes that we oversee from an economic standpoint, we actually conduct a merger review. The DOJ has a statutory right to provide its views, and we're the entity that approves or disapproves certain mergers and also imposes conditions. We also regulate rates, practices, and the common carrier obligation. And so you can see how those three issues kind of intersect. So carriers have to provide service upon reasonable request, and it has to be at reasonable rates and reasonable practices. And if any one of those pillars would fall, the whole transportation could be jeopardized or could create negative effects. And so there are kind of interwoven authorities to basically assure reasonableness when it comes to service rates and practices. We also have authority to oversee the broader competitive dynamics in various transportation modes, particularly rail. So this includes, for rail, it includes authorities such as reciprocal switching, terminal trackage rights, and through routes. And the basic idea is where provided under law, we have authority to potentially build in more competition in given markets through those mechanisms that I described. We also have a passenger rail oversight functions, resolving access rights disputes and on-time performance issues with Amtrak. But against that broad backdrop of our authority, we have to take care to provide relief mechanisms, to shippers and others where warranted. But we also must allow carriers to earn adequate revenue. And given the history of regulation at the agency, where we have seen sometimes overregulation lead to negative effects, it's incumbent upon the board to consider both of those imperatives.
So, looking at the supply chain more broadly, as well as how the pieces that you have authority over how they fit into that puzzle. What's the current state of congestion, and how do those pieces factor in that congestion?
It's a great question. And I know, as has been well discussed on this program, it's a challenging time for the supply chain, both domestically and internationally. Let me first say that the pandemic has obviously created unprecedented conditions in which, particularly, which all entities of the supply chain operate. And I think the men and women on the ground have done remarkable work to keep this country moving. In particular, in terms of the challenges. With outbreaks from the pandemic, we have seen hotspots of labor shortages, particularly at the first last mile. In the railroad industry, it's particularly at the first last mile of railroad service with, crews running local trains to spot and pull customer cars at their facilities. And we've seen some hotspots. It hasn't been, it hasn't been everywhere, and it hasn't been with every railroad. But the bigger issue, I think, right now, and most pressing issue is just with increasing intermodal demand. Driven by the recovery and shifting consumer preferences more towards, goods away from, say, services and experiences. We've seen, particularly as it pertains to the modes the STB oversees, we've seen railroads reduce or even suspend service involving certain intermodal yards, particularly in the Chicago area. But I think it would be oversimplifying to regard that as solely and fundamentally a railroad problem. Right. As you know, Jeff, and it was discussed today, and throughout the last couple of months, we've seen several months really. We've seen issues at originating ports and exporting countries, destination ports and terminals, and in importing countries, we've seen drayage and chassis issues on the front and especially the back end. Warehouse and distribution issues that then contribute to those chassis issues at origin and destination too. Certainly railroads are an integral part of our supply chain, but the intermodal supply chain by definition involves multiple modes and hubs between those modes. And, I think fundamentally the root cause relates to the pandemic, but the root cause exposes other problems in the supply chain and, or it intensifies those issues. And as I've heard others observe, I think, where those problems manifest most acutely is at the seams between modes. And I think it's incumbent upon policymakers with jurisdiction over various modes to work together to assess those challenges and to see whether or not we can advance solutions that ameliorate problems, understanding that we have that root cause.
I think that's a great way of putting it. And I think, those examples really show, as we all know, a problem in one area, the supply chain quickly spreads to other areas as well. And so you really need multimodal solutions to these issues. I think that's why it was so great to hear about the field hearing that you participated in with FMC commissioners in Memphis to discuss the state of intermodal transportation in the U.S. And I'm just wondering, who spoke at the hearing, and what are some of the lessons that were learned, and other perspectives that were provided there that might shed some light on how we work through this?
Yeah, so I really commend Commissioner Dye of the FMC, and of course Chairman Maffei for but Commissioner Dye has spurred these supply chain innovation teams. And at the hearing discussion in Memphis, we heard from a cross-section of entities in the supply chain, and this included BCOs like Nike and drayage companies like IMC companies. My fundamental takeaway, Jeff, from the Memphis supply chain innovation team and the discussion that we had there, and that's based on a substantial contingent of entities, is those entities felt that a gray pool for chassis would be a helpful solution for alleviating congestion, at least in the Memphis area, which does not have a gray pool. And basically they view the chassis market as siloed, and those silos lead to suboptimal chassis availability and to less efficient chassis movements. They have proposed a gray pool in which all of the chassis would be available regardless of who owns the chassis. Of course, chassis owners and providers have concerns with gray pools. They state that a gray pool would create, among other issues, decreased investment incentives. Personally, I'm grateful to any entity that comes forward with constructive solutions, and I of course deeply respect Commissioner Dye's expertise on these matters. As most chassis contracts involve ocean carriers and not rail carriers. But at the same time, much of the issue involves chassis at rail terminals, and that's exactly what we're starting to describe, which is those issues that kind of at the seams or involving multiple modes, which makes the solution set so difficult and challenging. Without forming a conclusion on a gray pool in any particular area of the country, I think that we want to continue partnering with FMC and other policymakers, including on the Hill, that might be examining this matter, and understanding our authorities, see where we could be helpful. And like I said, I'm appreciative of any solution that is brought forward, and certainly that's one that merits consideration.
And it seems like the chassis example, there's also a visibility part to that as well, just knowing, assuming you have access to them, that they're available, so you can essentially increase capacity by making the system as efficient as possible, within the current constraints. And so I'm also wondering, do you have thoughts about how we can improve visibility in the supply chain?
That's a great question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're so right. It's a great question. A couple things come to mind, Jeff. First is, I've heard some argue that ocean carriers could potentially do a better job providing information to rail carriers as to the identity of the BCO and on issues involving timing. In many instances, the rail carrier may not know who the BCO is, even for containers that do not involve multiple BCOs. And so, from their perspective, and better information would enable rail carriers both to plan better and to stack containers in a more efficient manner. If you could organize, for example, by BCO, and then also communicate with that BCO more freely because you know who they are about what the priority level is, you might be able to stack more urgent containers in one area and move it to another intermodal yard in others. And so, that type of organization, and communication between rail carriers and the BCOs, potentially could improve congestion at rail terminals. And of course, the railroads have oftentimes that commercial relationship with the ocean carrier, right, and not the BCO, and that's the rub. And at the same time, we have to respect ocean carriers' concerns about business sensitive information. But I will note that some ocean carriers have managed to overcome these concerns and share more information with rail carriers, and I think some are doing an excellent job. And confidentiality is achievable within information sharing. And it strikes me that it's an idea that also merits consideration, and you could see how it could be done very quickly, right? It's information sharing. It's not the establishment of a new entity. It's not the establishment of new transportation patterns. Save better stacking within rail terminals. Another idea as it pertains to visibility is that, I know of certain platforms that integrate supply chain data and then use advanced analytics to better predict timing across the supply chain. And without endorsing any particular platform, I certainly see how those types of efforts, are innovative and could be helpful. I think whether it's organizing back-end transportation, crew scheduling, etc. If you've got better predictive analytics, I think you can do a better job with those essential functions.
What about, and you talked about chassis a little bit, but what about containers? What about, alleviating, I guess in certain areas, there are folks suggesting that containers are unavailable. How do you solve that issue?
It's a great question. The unavailability it has a number of different causes. I think the improved stacking issue is fundamentally about stacking containers. So I think that if containers are stacked in a better way, and the more urgent containers are stacked in a more accessible way, that will have kind of a positive effect on the availability of that container for the entity that wants to pick it up. So that's a way in which I think we can improve container availability. So
fewer container modes.
That's one for example. But it is interesting. We've seen both for containers and chassis where, because people are concerned about the availability, then it almost creates a spiraling effect where they become more likely to hold on to things or more likely to quickly route things back to ensure availability for some other entity. But that is an example, Jeff, that I would give about information sharing and improved stacking at rail terminals.
One other thing that I think is very topical is weather disruptions, right? Wildfires, flooding, the Texas winter storm. How do you think we can make U.S. supply chains more resilient in the face of these types of weather disruptions that we've seen recently, and some of which we may see more of in the future?
Yeah, no, it's extremely important and timely question. I will say that I've been extraordinarily impressed with entities' ability to rebuild following natural disasters. I think we just saw the Union Pacific rebuild the Dry Canyon Bridge in under a month. Which is staggering considering the size and damage. And the same is true for much of the recovery from flooding in recent years. But as we know, we can't just rebuild. We have to rebuild in a more resilient way, right? We have to, and we've seen that, particularly when it comes to communication and wayside equipment. We have seen entities take steps, and I commend them for it, to not just replace what was there, but to say, if you've got communication or wayside detector, elevate it, right? So that when if we know that there's going to be more flooding and more severe flooding, they're better protected. So it's not just that we rebuild, but we rebuild in a more resilient way. I think that is essential. I think supply chain visibility is part of resiliency as well, because it helps manage when the crises get here. Winter and in general, ensuring a sufficient equipment and labor base, pre-positioning of assets, having enough slack in the system to account for those crises. When a key route is affected by a natural disaster and you have to reroute, obviously that adds hours, sometimes days, to transit time, which necessitates more crew and more equipment, right? Which then challenges whatever reserve capacity you had. Which is why I think being more resilient is not just on the kind of stationary hard infrastructure side, but it's also resiliency also extends to labor and to obviously mobile equipment and the like. So those are things that I think that we can think about, and like I said, other things when it comes to advanced technology, supply chain visibility would also be helpful.
So we've talked about weather disruptions, containers, chassis. So gazing into your crystal ball.
Yeah.
What opportunities and challenges do you think we'll see for the supply chain in the next few years, and do you think that we're ready for them?
A great question. I think the most exciting opportunity relates to technology. So, beyond the supply chain visibility, I think that there are, three long-term changes that continually come up. Increased automation, capacity enhancements, and energy advancements. So let's just take rail. If you look at rail control their right-of-way. Unlike, say, highways, which you have multiple entities and oftentimes state ownership. Railroads are on a fixed guideway. They're vertically integrated when it comes to both their infrastructure and rolling stock. They have currently an interoperable communication backbone, which may not be where it needs to be from an advancement standpoint, but it's certainly a backbone. And they have more revenue units per haul to spread the cost of power advancements, harnessing, low friction benefits of steel wheel on steel rail. And I think when you look at, automation when it comes to operations, you look at capacity improvements such as dynamic block, using the location of trains to not have fixed blocks, but to have moving blocks so that trains can run closer together when they're occupying a block, freeing up capacity. And then I think you see energy making locomotives more efficient through harnessing alternative fuels or battery power, which you see advanced research on. I think you can see how all of those would capitalize on those kind of underlying fundamentals that I discussed. And as technology advances in those domains, you can see how rail service and, by extension, the supply chain would be transformed. So, the entire economics of a train move change. So, you could see train length differ. You could see direct rail routing change such that there is decreased use of intermediate and local yards and more direct OD railroad moves. The possibilities really are kind of endless, and this is just in rail. Now you extend to trucking and automated trucking, which has been well documented. Of course, it's not something that the board directly regulates, but you could see similar game-changing developments within the trucking sphere. Everything from platooning to longer operations. And so, I think that the most exciting opportunity, comes from increasing technology. I also think, by the way, that we should do it in a way that improves safety. So if you think about, wayside detectors when it comes to, wheel detectors, wheel detection and track geometry and other things, whether through things that are along, the wayside detections that are along the rail route or drones that are along the rail route, you could see how the increased technology could yield increased safety, and we start to see that already. And so I think that is the biggest opportunity across transportation is to continue progressing in those domains, automation, capacity, and energy, and of course they all intersect.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting input, especially given that the administration is looking at the transportation industrial base as part of its supply chain review. So that seems very, very topical for that review that DOT is putting together. Administration also issued an executive order promoting competition in the American economy. I think that was earlier this summer. And the EO encouraged your agency to consider a number of actions concerning access regulations for freight rail and preference rights for passenger rail. I was wondering whether you could discuss the significance of that executive order and how it may influence STB's work.
Yeah, no, it's I think whenever the President of the United States articulates a policy view, it obviously draws attention from the public. And as I mentioned, we're an independent agency, and we make decisions on the merits, and we consider the facts and arguments before us in any given proceeding. And so from that standpoint, we're fortunate to be a bit insulated, and we certainly cherish our independence. I think the significance of the executive order, really pertains to the issues on which members of the public focus on, in which they brief the board. And that in turn affects the facts and arguments that we consider. And we already see those effects in terms of what people are focusing on at the board. So our decision making is independent, and we respond to the facts and arguments. But as members of the public get additional ideas and bring additional facts and arguments to bear, that then changes what we then consider. So I think that's the predominant effect is the public salience of it, which then affects the briefings that come before us. But our decision making itself, Jeff, I think we're independent and we cherish that, and I think that will continue. And by the way, I would note that the executive order recognizes that, and takes pains, I think, to in some places to recognize our independence, and so we appreciate that.
Oh yeah, no, there's always somebody there making sure that when there's a clause that relates to independent agencies, it'll never say shall. It'll always say are encouraged to.
I think you and I can both recall.
That's going to make sure that's in there.
I think you and I can recall previous executive orders, over the last several years that take similar pains. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a well ingrained culture.
I was really careful about that.
That review those documents. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you're so right.
Yep. So you talked about stakeholders a little bit. And, you've thrown out a lot of really fascinating points here today, and there are a lot of stakeholders that are interested in, goods movement issues and in some of the modes that you regulate. And what's the best way they can interact with the STB to make their voices heard and bring issues to the agency's attention?
Well, I'm very glad you asked. At some point I'm going to tattoo the number and email address of the Rail Customer Public Assistance Program. So for those that may not know, the Rail Customer Public Assistance Program is, we've stood it up to basically be the informal dispute resolution entity at the agency. It is walled off from the decision-making function of the board. So the people you are talking to at RCPA are not the people who are going to be drafting initial cuts of the decision. They are separate. They exist to brief Congress, the public, but to listen to the public and to resolve disputes. They maintain contacts across all of the carriers that we regulate, and they have good relationships, and the carriers proactively provide information to make sure that they are current on what is transpiring in the industry. And they get inquiries from the public, shippers, railroads themselves, ocean carriers, water carriers, et cetera, about our authorities, and try to either give guidance on the law or to try and connect parties to find solutions. So last year I think they fielded over 1,000 inquiries on a wide variety of issues, many of which involve service, and they stand ready. And so their number, and I have to put in the plug, is 202-245-0238, and it's RCPA at stb.gov. And, they stand ready throughout business hours to provide that service to the public. That's the best way to get your issues heard immediately and to try and work towards a solution rather than litigation of the board. And, the difference is that, I maintain an open door policy. I think all the board members love to hear from the public. That is an essential part of our job. But when it comes to individual disputes, of course, we can't be involved on the front end if we're going to then have to adjudicate it. So, that's the kind of the line that we have, which is we can listen to people, but when it comes to an individual dispute between particular entities, the public is better off going to our RCPA program for that informal dispute resolution, which can oftentimes avert litigation.
So I have noted that. One last question. STB had a change in chairmanship this year. A few new members were confirmed. Could you speak to what those changes have meant for the board, and how do you think that affects the board's priorities and potential actions affecting supply chain going forward?
Yeah, it's both of those changes have been very important. Former Chairman Begeman had a major positive impact across multiple domains. From demurrage policy to really board administration. Things that people don't see, like IT security and financial policy and the like. And that really positions the agency well for administration for really decades to come. And she's initiated efforts about data management that I think will be beneficial over many years. So former Chairman Chairman Oberman, has emphasized his desire to see railroads focus more on growth in support of broader environmental and economic benefits and to reduce congestion on highways. And so along these lines, he has increased focus on certain competitive authorities and on the common carrier obligation. And, he has stood up a passenger rail unit to explore a passenger rail office to help the board carry out some of its passenger rail authorities that I mentioned earlier when it comes to access rights and particularly on-time performance, given that there is a new regulation that has taken effect. So those are priorities for him going forward. And both chairmen are extraordinarily energetic, and so that continues at the board. The change to 5 members has been extremely significant. So not only are Robert Primus and Michelle Schultz, really valued colleagues and important voices, but having 5 members enables individual board members to talk to one another. So, since its creation in '96, the STB had 3 members. And some people don't know that with 3 members, when any 2 talk, it triggers the Sunshine Act. And because it could form a majority of the board, so you can't talk directly about pending matters at the board without there being an open meeting. So that type of informal collaboration is something we couldn't do before.
Right.
We could talk, of course, about the general state of the rail industry or whatever industry we might be discussing. But we couldn't say, hey, I want to make a red line change on this decision. And so now with 5, we can directly collaborate with one another. And I think that helps help us come to consensus decisions. I think even when we can't come to consensus, I think we better understand each other's perspectives. And I think that'll have long-term, benefits at the board when it comes to both the strength of our decision making as well as kind of the interpersonal relationships at the board. And I think it's already been fantastic to have 5 members on the board, and I think it'll continue.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for coming. This was awesome. A lot of fun.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been great. And, look forward to continuing the discussion and all these developments.
Absolutely. I look forward to it too.
So that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this in all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube where you can like and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.